welcome to Dragon Tree. Today we're going to discuss Booleans and all of the tips and tricks you need to know to make use of this awesome and very powerful tool. The first thing to know is if you go to your Variables tab, we can create a Boolean variable. So drop down from number, choose Boolean, we'll call this test bool. Now we have our test bool set up, and from our Variables tab, we get to define whether it starts in a false state or a true state. Imagine you had a cricket chirping in the background like we do here. Well, you could set this to be true, which would mean cricket is chirping. And so then if we come to when world is started, we could use on our events tab an if statement and say if, and then simply drag your Boolean in, and it'll say if crickets are chirping, then we can do an action. So for instance, we could turn chirping off. You could also bring in a second if statement and run a not. Under your operators, if you go down to not and drag this in, and then we're going to grab the test bool, place it, and make sure it's highlighting, and then joystick to the right to duplicate. If not test bool, meaning it's in a false state, we can now make sure that it's not true. So if the crickets aren't chirping, then what do? It kind of functions like an else, but it's also super valuable when dealing with Booleans. And here's why. Because if we go to our values tab, normally you'll grab the set2 value at the top, which we're going to do as well. Drop this here at the bottom. And if you scroll down, you can set the value to be a Boolean input. And so if you know that you want test bool to be false, you can simply set it to false when world is started. But what if you want it to just flip states? For instance, if we go to our events tab and scroll down and grab when trigger is entered by player, let's play the cricket sounds if it's true, and if it's not true, let's turn it off. And then immediately we have to set it to false. And so you might think, okay, well, I'll just drag this in here and drag this in here and set one to true, one to false, and that'll flip it. But the problem is, if you go through test bool and then set it to false, then it immediately fires the second if statement because this doesn't actually work like an else statement. And that's unfortunate, but we have a really cool trick. And that's instead of using set bool to the Boolean value, we actually come over to our operators tab again, grab that not statement, and then another option for getting your variable is just to head back to the Variables tab. We can just grab it from here. And so we can set the test bool to be not test bool. And what this actually does is really incredible because it doesn't set it to be false. What it does is it sets it to be the opposite of whatever it currently is. So when the trigger is entered, if it's true, it sets it to false. And so it flips the state. Now, this is super valuable, but with a trigger enter event or even an object collision event, often the event will go off twice. And so what I'd recommend you do is say when trigger is entered by player, specifically a trigger, you have two options. And so we go to our actions tab and you can disable object. And so what disable object does is it disables the trigger that this is running on. So if we disable self, then what we can do is go down to our events tab, scroll to the very bottom, you're going to grab send event with delay. And so after we've set the test bool to be the opposite, we can send, say, my event with a delay of 1 second, scroll to the top where we can grab when event is received. And now when event is received, we can then, instead of disabling self, we need the opposite. So under actions, we can grab enable object. And now we can enable self. And it's really important to note here that when it says enable object, disable object, this specifically works on triggers and triggers alone. So don't expect this to do anything else. If you want to affect simulation, you can use set simulated. And there's a lot of other options here under your actions tab and as well under your motion tab, depending on what type of object you're working with. Let me show you a trick that I use all the time. So say we only need to know if it's true. We don't need to know if it's not true. Well, then we can delete the if statement. We just need to make sure to move this send event up into the test bool. And so now, as long as test bool is set to a default of true, because remember over here, if it's set to false, this won't run the first time. So we have to make sure the variable is set up correctly. And so now we say if test bool is true, but how do we disable it from getting a double tap? Well, if you go back to your values tab, scroll up and grab the set2, and here we can now set the test bool to be on our values tab, scroll down, grab Boolean input, and this is when we'd want to set it to false because this only runs one time. And then over here, when my event is received, instead of setting it to false, we set it to true. And we don't want to just flip this just in case my event goes off more than one time or there's some issue. We know that whenever my event is received, we want to enable. In fact, that's a good reason to change the name of this. So click new event name, and we'll call this enable. And that way we know when enable is received. And so rather than sending my event, we'll grab the enable event. And so now we're sending enable to self with a 1 second delay, or you could change this. And so another really cool trick I want to show you while we're talking about Booleans and sending events is if you come to your variables tab, we can create a new number variable called delay. And this delay we can set in here to be, let's say, 10 seconds. And then we drag it over into our seconds tab. And now we're sending the event with a variable delay. If we grab an object like this cube, and let's open it up and then drag down and attach the script to Booleans. On our object, what you're going to see is we have the variable delay as well as the test bool. And so if we knew that on some objects we didn't want the delay to be 10 seconds, we could change it for this specific object to be 15 seconds. We've really just begun to scratch the surface on what you can do with Boolean values. And so I want to take it one step further before I let you go today. If we come back to our variables tab, we could have several variables, say, and now we've got two variables, one for global voice and one for respawn players. And now if you set these to true, and remember, they can be set on the object itself. So we could have some objects that are not true and some that are, and some that are a variation of both. And now when the trigger is entered by player, we could then say if test bool, and if we come into our events tab, we can nest ifs. And so we can say if this and this, we can then do, so if global voice is true, if respawn players is true, then we go down to our motion tab, grab the respawn player. We can now respawn the player, and it obviously wouldn't be on self, but it would be on an object called respawn. But then we could also go down to the actions tab and grab set player voice settings, and we can set the player's voice settings to global for that player. And so now we've got a Boolean defining if we want to give them global voice. And if we put these on separate tabs, but both underneath the test bool, it says, okay, if the test bool is true, then we respawn players if that's true, and or we give global voice if that's true. And as you can see, this just unlocks an infinite number of possibilities in ways that you can reuse scripts. One other really important thing to note about scripts is you do not need to have individual script blocks per object. So this single Boolean script can be used on any number of objects. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you in Horizon. Bye!